Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Indian Pudding, America's Forgotten Dessert by Tasting History. Now this is our first Tasting History with Max Miller reaction on the channel. I've watched a few of his videos on my own time, and I very much enjoyed them. I mean, we haven't done any cooking videos on this channel, but of course we've done a lot of history, so I felt this would be an interesting one to do. And in terms of Indian pudding, I've definitely heard of Indian pudding before. It sort of feels like a sort of old-timey type of dessert. I think it's related to, or is it the same thing as hasty pudding? I'm not quite sure, but I guess it fits with the title, America's Forgotten Dessert, that I couldn't really tell you much about Indian pudding beyond that. So I'm definitely excited to learn about this and learn about some of the history, which Max Miller usually does a fantastic job of. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
One of America's oldest desserts is something called Indian pudding, and it is the perfect marriage of Old World ingredients and New World ingredients. Now, you don't find it very often today, except at a few restaurants in New England, and of course on shows like this.
Yeah, I've never eaten Indian pudding. Like I said in the intro, I couldn't even tell you what goes into it, though I'm getting a few hints from the image here. But yeah, I really don't know much about it, aside from the fact that I've definitely heard the term Indian pudding before.
So today I'm going to be making a 19th century recipe for Indian pudding, perfect for your Thanksgiving table.
Okay.
So thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video as we uncover the history of America's Indian pudding, this time on Tasting History.
I figure it's pretty classic for Americans to label something Indian this,
So what
Indian
exactly
that.
is Indian about Indian pudding?
Right.
Well, it is the main ingredient, corn. See, the dish was originally made similarly to a classic British pudding, but instead of using wheat, the British colonists of the 17th and 18th century used maize, which they called Indian corn.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense, given that, I mean, today corn is something which is eaten around the world, but of course, when these colonists arrived in the Americas, corn was something quite different for them, and so to them it seemed like it was this sort of indigenous Indian thing, right? And they were adapting it into their diets. And of course, in the US, we have things like cornbread and cornmeal. And, I mean, corn is a big part of our diets around the world, but particularly in the United States today. But that was a change for the English colonists who had arrived in the Americas.
Hence, Indian pudding. Now, there are numerous ways to make this pudding. Some are really fancy, but generally, they're pretty simple. Just corn, molasses, and milk. And that's why...
That makes a lot of sense. If you think about the ingredients that would have been available to people back in the day, if we're talking colonial times, well, milk, that makes sense. But honestly, corn and molasses, those would have been more widely available. To my understanding, molasses was often used as a sweetener are used in desserts. And in fact, if you were using sugar at that time, say back in the 1700s, for example, and I know he's using a bit of a later recipe, but if we look back at the 18th century, the colonial era, only the wealthiest of the wealthy would have access to pure white processed sugar, like most of us use today. Most people would be using, first of all, not a lot of sugar, and the sugar that they had would be brown sugar, which means it still has the molasses in it. So there was a lot of molasses being used back then.
In around the year 1800, Count Rumford wrote, "In America is called a plain Indian pudding. Certainly holds the first place, and cannot fail to be liked. It is not only cheap and wholesome, but a great delicacy."
Okay.
Now, since there are many ways to make this pudding, I first opted for one of the more complex, which included eggs and butter, and came from the 1796 cookbook American Cookery by Amelia Simmons. And I have no doubt that this recipe could work with the right method, but she doesn't really give much of a method, and so when I followed exactly what she said, it turned out to be a complete disaster.
Yeah, I think you'll find that, not that I've read a whole lot of historical recipe books, but, sometimes you come across these things reading about life in the past. I feel like a lot of older recipes, I don't know when the breaking point was, but a lot of older recipes were really quite vague about what you were specifically supposed to do. And also, when you look at recipes from back in, say, the 1700s, sometimes they're relying on cultural references or common knowledge that we just don't have anymore, right? They're relying on, if you're reading something in the 1790s, that everyone would have known this particular technique or style of cooking, and today we are entirely unfamiliar with it, so it can be, once again, not that I've actually adapted any recipes, but I imagine it can be pretty difficult to try and adapt these recipes into things that actually work today.
I mean, look at this thing.
Oh.
It's really soft and undercooked.
Yeah.
At the same time,
A little bit mushy.
it's really hard and overcooked.
Ew.
Honestly, it's quite the miracle of physics, and I decided I needed to do something else. So after my frustration subsided, I decided to look at a slightly later recipe from 1829, written by Lydia Child. Now, Lydia Child, besides being a cookbook author and novelist, was an abolitionist and an activist for the rights of Native Americans, which seems appropriate for this dish and will be made clear when we get to the history section of the video. Now, the recipe comes from her cookbook called The American Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy.
Love that.
And is for baked Indian pudding. Indian pudding is good baked. Scald a quart of milk, skimmed milk will do, and stir in 7 tablespoonfuls of sifted Indian meal, a teaspoonful of salt, a teacupful of molasses, and a great spoonful of ginger or sifted cinnamon. Bake 3 or 4 hours. If you want whey, you must be sure and pour in a little cold milk after it is all mixed.
Okay, so a simpler recipe for, as stated, the frugal housewife. If you don't have all the butter and eggs and all that type of thing, you can make this a little more easily, which is probably how a lot of people would have made it over the years. Though, of course, when we talk about recipes, I mean, really prior to, I don't know, even prior to the 20th century, you'll find that a lot of these old recipes, there wasn't one particular way to do it. You'll find 100, 1,000 different ways that people made different recipes depending upon the region or the community, and only later were some of these things actually written down.
Now, a 3 or 4 hour bake is quite a long bake, but there are other recipes that bake it for 5 to 6, and still others that have you boil it for up to 12 hours.
Wow.
So if you're looking for something that will take you a little bit less time baking, then might I suggest a delightful baked good from today's sponsor, Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first Bake from Frozen subscription box that works with small bakers around the country to...
That's kind of crazy. So I've got Max's video linked down below, so you can go and check it out. Go leave him a like, subscribe, basically go and show him some support for making these videos that we all enjoy to watch and react to. So I'll let the rest of the ad play through.
But at this time of year, I really gravitate to things like the cranberry pecan rolls, which are perfect for all of the family gatherings that we have around this time of year. And while you can enjoy all of the baked goods from Wild Grain by yourself, you can also share it with others by sending someone a box as a gift or giving an e-gift card right into their inbox. So if you want to give Wild Grain a try, and I suggest that you do, then you can get $30 off of your first box plus free croissants for the life of the subscription. Just head to wildgrain.com/tastinghistory and use my code TASTINGHISTORY to get $30 off of your first box plus free croissants for life. Now, as of now, Wild Grain does not have an Indian pudding in their selection, so we're going to have to make that one on our own. So for that, what you'll need is 1 quart or 1 liter of milk, skimmed or whole milk, a half cup or 80 grams of cornmeal, 1 teaspoon of salt, a half cup or 180 grams of molasses, 1.5 teaspoons of ginger or...
I will say I'm not going to be cooking the Indian pudding, but that would really take the reaction to another level. Not only reacting to the video, but actually following along with the recipe. Perhaps interesting, but today we're just going to see how Max does it.
Cinnamon, and another half cup or 120 milliliters of cold milk. So we need to start by scalding the milk, that is, heating it just below the boiling point. So slowly warm it on the stove until it reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 Celsius, stirring constantly so that it doesn't burn to the bottom of the pot. You can also use a double boiler if you have one. As it warms, whisk the salt into the cornmeal, and then once the milk hits 180 degrees, reduce the heat to low and add in the cornmeal. Continue to stir on very low heat for 10 minutes. That'll give some time for the cornmeal to absorb a good amount of the milk, which helps it not just fall to the bottom of the pot. That actually may have been one of the mistakes that I made with the rather disastrous pudding that I made. We're all learning here. Now after 10 minutes,
Fair.
you want to add in the molasses and stir for another 2 minutes, and then finally add in the ginger. And it's best if you sift it in so it doesn't clump. Stir for another minute or until everything is nice and smooth, and then take it off the heat. Then butter a 9 by 9 inch baking dish and pour the pudding mixture into it. Now here the recipe says that if you want whey, then you should add some cold milk. And I see this in a lot of the 19th century recipes for Indian pudding, and what that is I guess they wanted the whey in the milk to separate for some reason. It was very popular at the time, but later recipes don't seem to always include that, so maybe it went out of fashion. I don't know.
See, that is one of those things that, once again, if you were around at the time, probably would have been expected. You might have understood, or, just common knowledge of the time. But now looking back, we're sort of like, why was this a practice? I mean, maybe someone knows. I couldn't tell you. But one of those things that we have to sort of parse out reading in retrospect.
But I figure I'll give it a shot, so I'm going to pour a half cup of the cold milk in, and I'm not going to stir it. Just set it straight into the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 Celsius, and bake for 3 to 4 hours. Wow. And while it bakes, I wanted to let you know that I was finally able to get some more tasting history pins in stock. There is, of course, the logo, the beautiful garum bottle, and you can't forget the hardtack. They sold out in like 2 days last time I got them, so if you want them, I'll put a link in the description, but once they're gone, they're probably gone for quite some time. And now, let us look at the origins of that most American pudding, Indian pudding.
Here we go.
So it's kind of hard to know where to start with the history of this pudding because there are lots of places that I could start, but for lack of a better place, let's start with hasty pudding.
Hey!
Now the first
I think I mentioned that in the intro. I knew there was some connection between the two.
Recipes for hasty pudding date from the 17th century, many from Robert May's The Accomplished Cook. Now originally hasty pudding was so called because it was hasty. It didn't take a long time to make. Back then, making a pudding was an all-day affair. You would have your flour and fat and usually some fruit, and you'd put it in a bag and boil it for like 10 to 12 hours.
Wow.
But, according to the 1633 writings of Thomas Heywood, he said of hasty pudding, longer in eating than it was in making. And yes, he wrote then, even though it should be than, which just goes to show how different the English language is today, because an English teacher, like my mother, would definitely mark you off for using then when you should use than. Anyway, while hasty pudding...
I don't know if that was just a mistake or if they were actually interchangeable at the time. I would say editing was a lot less common for your manuscript back at that time.
Should be very quick to make. By the time Robert May was writing, some of them take several hours to make. But it is likely the more simple hasty pudding that was in the mind of the English colonists in Massachusetts at the end and middle of the 17th century.
Right, so they bring hasty pudding over from England to the Americas. They find that, they might not have some of the ingredients they did in England, or perhaps other ingredients like corn are more common now, and so they substitute some things out. I'm imagining that's how we get to Indian pudding, and then the Indian comes from the corn. And like I said earlier, a lot of these colonists come over, and even though they displace indigenous settlers, or not indigenous settlers, the settlers displace the indigenous people, they push them out, they push them westwards. There's a series of continuing wars throughout the colonial era into the, of course, history of the United States. They do like to name things after sometimes just Indian or specific tribes, right? So you do see, going around America today, a lot of different locations and towns and foods and items and all types of things with the moniker of Indian or native or named after a particular tribe, even though not all, but the vast majority of the indigenous people were actually pushed out of these communities, well, a long time ago now.
The only issue was that, at least at first, they couldn't make them the way that they did back in England because they didn't have wheat to make flour. What they did have was the North American version, and that would be corn. Now, the Native Americans of the region had been using corn, or maize, to make many dishes which could be considered pudding-like. In 1673, the French missionary Father Marquette wrote of a meal prepared by the Mississippians, saying that
each continent or each place, region, needs their staple crop. You've got wheat throughout Europe in a lot of places, maize in a lot of the Americas. You have rice in a lot of Asia, right? You need your staple sort of carb that you can survive on, and corn's a pretty good one.
The French missionary Father Marquette wrote of a meal prepared by the Mississippians, saying that the first course was a great wooden platter full of sagamite, that is to say, meal of Indian corn boiled in water and seasoned with fat. So it's not exactly a British boiled pudding, but it is similar to the more simplified hasty puddings that were popular back in England. And a slightly earlier description of this dish, though it's actually by a different name, talks about how the British colonists took the dish and changed it to make it their own. In 1643, the Puritan minister Roger Williams wrote the first dictionary of the Algonquin language known as Narragansett, and he described nosomp, a kind of meal pottage, unparched. From this the English call their somp, which is the Indian corn beaten and boiled, and eaten hot or cold with milk or butter, which are mercies beyond the natives' plain water, and which is a dish exceeding wholesome for the English bodies. That somp, which seems similar to modern-day grits, would actually turn into a boiled pudding when it was put into a cloth and then boiled for a long time. Now, that dictionary that Roger Williams wrote was actually really influential to the modern English language, because it was where a lot of the loan words from Algonquin entered the language. Words like moccasin, moose, papoose, powwow, squash, and succotash.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there has to be some entry point, right? Because all of these settlers who are coming, we'll talk about North America in particular in this case, and English in particular, all these English settlers, even narrowing it down that much, they were encountering a lot of different indigenous tribes. And of course, I mean, there have been loanwords taken from a lot of different groups of people, but we find that some texts, some figures or translators are more influential than others, and Williams is a good example of that.
Also, he himself was quite an interesting man. He was a Puritan and a minister, but he was remarkably forward-thinking for his age, and
well, he was famously, I don't know if you'd officially call him a dissenter, but famously sort of broke with a lot of his community.
Where he was living, he was all for religious tolerance and a complete separation of church and state, and so that often put him at loggerheads with the other Puritans in Massachusetts, which is why he eventually got kicked out of the colony and had to start his own little plantation, Providence Plantation, which later on would become Rhode Island.
Yeah, I mean, to simplify it, that's why we get Rhode Island, right? Because, like I said, Roger Williams was, in some sense, a dissenter from his own religious community. And, of course, we're already talking about a pretty radical and fringe religious community, the Puritans. He was, I guess, fringe in a different way. So he starts his own community, which, becomes Rhode Island. So shout out Roger Williams. He's a name that's well known to those familiar with New England colonial North American history. The Puritans, and the reason he was so radical is because the Puritans are often framed as sort of these settlers who came over for the sake of religious freedom and etc., which sounds very nice, and to a certain extent that's true, but the type of religious freedom the Puritans wanted was the freedom to make their own extremely exclusionary communities. So the Puritans wanted to set up their own communities that really would not include anybody else, and they would live by their own standards, their own religious principles, and they were not tolerant of any other kind of religion, especially not Catholics, but any other kind of religion. So they were actually incredibly intolerant. They wanted a spot where they could set up and establish their own communities. Now, of course, when arriving, what they found is that there were already people there. The indigenous tribes were already there, which of course leads to a series of conflicts and wars. But that's why Roger Williams, you had that breaking point because his view of things was quite different from the prevailing Puritan attitude in Massachusetts Bay.
Now, as for the dish that he described, the samp, we can see that even by 1643, the foundations of what would become Indian pudding were there. There was the North American ingredient of maize, or Indian corn, and the European ingredients of butter and milk, which were not used in native cuisine at the time. Now, they didn't seem to be sweetening the dish with sugar or molasses, which hadn't really come over yet, but they did start adding berries. In England, they would usually use Zante currants, or the small currants that came from Greece. But in America, where they didn't have those, they would use dried blueberries.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you think about cooking at that time, our sugar consumption is so incredibly high today. There was just so much less sugar in food at that time. And particularly today, I mean, America eats more sugar than even other comparable countries, but just around the world, we eat a lot more sugar now than we did. All types of food have sugar in them, and, sweet treats have an incredible amount of sugar in them, right? But if we're talking back, especially in the early colonial times, you're not going to have access to a lot of sugar. Now, particularly as these sugar plantations develop in places like Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, there will be a growing supply of sugar. But as I mentioned earlier, if you're just a regular person, having access to, white sugar was not really attainable. It was quite expensive. And so you might be dealing with brown sugar. Even that, you wouldn't have much. And so you're going to have to use other sweeteners. Molasses might have been an option, but even more common, if you're just a regular individual, was to use fruits and berries to sweeten baked goods you were making, right? That was the most affordable way of making things sweet, right? And so you could compare today eating something like a blueberry, eating fruit, which we find sweet, but also a little tart, right? That would have been your sweetener at that time, versus the mountains and mountains of sugar we pour into things today. There's quite a difference in sugar consumption. If you could bring someone from the 17th century now, they would find a lot of the food we eat to be unbearably sweet, I reckon.
The Indians dry them in the sun and sell them to the English by the bushel, who make use of them instead of currants, putting of them into puddings, both boiled and baked, and into water gruel. But by the 18th century, the British had started to bring over sugar and molasses to sweeten the puddings, and so you tend to see most of the berries fall out of the recipes, and the recipes tend to start looking more like the one that we're actually making today. Now, by the end of the 18th century, Indian pudding had become so popular in New England that it actually made its way back across the pond to Old England with the exaltation of Count Rumford, who wrote not only of the pudding, but of Indian corn, a kind of food which I believe to be beyond comparison the most nourishing, cheapest, and most wholesome that can be procured for feeding the poor. The common people in the northern parts of Italy live almost entirely upon it, and throughout the whole continent of America, it makes a principal article of food.
Yeah, so you can see from the way he talks about corn, you can tell that, corn is becoming increasingly popular and increasingly entrenched in a lot of communities, both in the Americas and beyond. But also from that description, you can still tell that this is something which he finds to be somewhat novel and something worth explaining how prevalent corn is becoming. Of course, we live in the world of corn today with how prevalent corn is in everything we eat, and corn syrup and all that sort of stuff. And really, as soon as you see the discovery or the landing of Europeans in the Americas, the process of the world becoming cornified begins.
He says in Italy they were eating it as polenta, and it was very similar to the hasty pudding that was popular in Britain. And he says that this Indian corn was much more nourishing than rice, which was the common food of many of the poor people in England at the time. Now he says it can be used to make a bread, cornbread essentially, but it is better to be used to make a pudding that would be boiled, similar to the recipe that we're making today, except that he does call for it to be put into a bag and boiled for 8 to 12 hours. And then he says it should be served with a sauce of either brown sugar and butter or vinegar, which seems odd.
Gross.
But if vinegar isn't your bag on your pudding, then he does say that there are other ways to kind of zhuzh it up by adding various kinds of berries found wild in the woods, such as huckleberries, bellberries, whortleberries, etc. And dried cherries and plums may be made use of in the same manner. Whortleberries, I love that name, whortleberry. It has to be one of my favorite berry names.
I will say something I was just thinking about is that it's also worth mentioning that when we think of corn today, you're thinking of your very stereotypical yellow corn on the cob. But as is actually evidence in Max's background here, corn back then did not all look like that. Now, of course, there was some yellow corn like we know today, but the corn we have now has been, bred through artificial selection and GMOs to look one particular way. We've done the same thing with all types of fruits and vegetables. That's why there's only basically one type of banana remaining. There used to be more of a diversity among these different crops. And so you had all different types of corn, different colors, which may have made for different flavors and textures and uses. And so keep that in mind also when you think about the cooking of this era, is that literally the corn they're talking about might have in some cases been quite different from the corn we think of today.
And is much better than the other name for this berry, which is the European blueberry, even though it's actually not a blueberry, but they are blue. Anyway, while Count Rumford introduced Indian pudding to Europe, it was also making its way as far as Australia, where as late as 1830, corn, or Indian corn, maize, was seen as only fit for animal consumption. This led newspapers to have to run articles discussing Indian corn, the uses of maize as human food. And these tended to include recipes for...
And of course, we still use corn for animal feed in part today, but it's also very much recognized as human food.
Indian pudding. It also became popular in the American South to some degree, finding its way into cookbooks like the Virginia Housewife, but really it was in New England where this dish flourished. In fact, it was said to be one of the favorite dishes of our second president, John Adams.
Wow.
A cousin of John Adams's family, Josiah Quincy, recalled visiting the former president's home as a boy. I well remember the modest dinners at the president's, to which I brought a schoolboy's appetite. The pudding, generally composed of boiled cornmeal, always constituted the first course. This was the custom of the time, it being thought desirable to take the edge off one's hunger before reaching the joint of meat. I can distinctly picture to myself a certain iron spoon which the old gentleman once fished up from the depths of a pudding in which it had been unwittingly cooked. And even long after he left office, after his wife Abigail had passed away, Indian pudding still found a place on the table of John Adams. In 1820, at the age of 85, he wrote to his daughter-in-law about how content he was living at his home in New England. There he kept busy doing simple, old-fashioned things like making shoes and weaving cloth, eating fat turkeys, roast beef, and Indian pudding. And more than that, mince pies and plum pudding in abundance, besides cranberry tarts.
Okay, he was living well, huh?
I also love that at the end of this letter, just like grandparents today, he kind of has to beg for his grandsons to pay him some attention and write to him. Tell the boys if they do not write to me, I will set up pretensions of the authority over them as a grandfather. Sadly, as John Adams by this time was kind of seen as a relic of the colonial period of America, so too did Indian pudding seem like a relic. It was already seen as kind of old-fashioned. Now, it didn't go away, but it was definitely not in vogue like ice cream had become.
God damn, that guy he's enjoying that ice cream. So, it's interesting, even at that time, Indian pudding was sort of an old-fashioned thing, something your grandpa might like from back in the 1780s or something. Guys, it's the 1820s, okay? We're long past that. Versus today, when I reckon a lot of Americans probably haven't even heard of Indian pudding. If I had to guess, maybe it's more common in New England, but like I've said before, I've certainly never eaten it. I didn't really know anything about it, though I have heard the name. But if I had to guess, I'd guess that probably a lot of Americans have never heard of this at all these days.
In an 1818 poem called Baked Beans, the author, who is an older gentleman, wistfully recalls his youth in New England, often talking about the foods that he had. Oh, how my heart sighs for my own native land, where potatoes and squashes and cucumbers grow.
So is this a poem Okay. I mean, I heard him, but I didn't believe him until I saw it. A poem titled Baked Beans. Yeah, it's either got to be from, well, I mean, honestly, baked beans. Very either British or Boston. Boston baked beans.
Where cheer and good welcome are always at hand, and custards and pumpkin pies smoke in a row. Oh, give me my country, the land of my teens, of the dark Indian pudding and pot of baked beans. But just because something is seen as old-fashioned, that doesn't mean that it fades away entirely.
Yeah.
In fact, the dish had a bit of a resurgence in the mid-19th century with the abolitionist movement. It was often seen as a better dish rather than rice pudding, which was then popular because rice at the time was mostly coming from the Carolinas, a product of slave labor.
Interesting. So could be sort of an embargo, right? Because that was one of the tactics abolitionists at the time used, was to try and embargo items that used or relied on slave labor. Of course, a lot of things did at that time, anything involving cotton. But rice, as you pointed out, there were a lot of rice plantations in the Carolinas in particular. So that's interesting that Indian pudding became a part of that equation.
And corn was not. Then it had another resurgence around 1876 when different foods which had been popular at the founding of the country were laid out on tables to celebrate America's centennial. And even after the centennial parties had ended, the dish remained relevant in New England, especially in Massachusetts, where it was a common inclusion in cookbooks through the 1940s.
Guys, we gotta bring it back. I feel like it's entirely disappeared. It needs another revival.
In fact, it was actually the famous dish served at the Toll House in Massachusetts by Ruth Wakefield. It was only after she invented chocolate chip cookies that the Indian pudding started to become less popular and people were going there for the cookies. Of course, by then the dish had changed substantially. It was typically made a lot sweeter and was definitely more of a dessert and was often served, and still is today, often served with some ice cream.
So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? So even by the mid to late 1800s, the appetites, the tastes of the time had changed. And so to make it more palatable to a later generation, you've added a lot more sugar and some fat from added ice cream, right? So even by the late 1800s, the, like I said, tastes had changed.
But while our version is not served with ice cream, many of the recipes from this time do say to serve it with a thickened cream, which is basically whipped cream. So that's what I'm going to do once I take it out of the oven. So once it's baked for 3 hours, take it out of the oven and let it cool pretty much entirely. Now you'll see that the top has created kind of a film, and I'm not sure if that's right or not. Really can't tell with this recipe, but that's where we are. That's what happened. But once it cooled entirely, it did firm up. So serve it up and add a bit of lightly whipped cream, and here we are. An Indian pudding from Lydia Childs, The Frugal Housewife from 1829. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is one of the least attractive dishes that I have ever made.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it didn't look so bad in the bowl, but when he was putting it out, it looks a little bit like slop. No offense.
It does not look pretty, but it smells so good.
Yeah, but I mean, corn with some cream, maybe sweetened a little bit, maybe some molasses. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good combination. It's a pudding, right? So it probably tastes pretty good.
The molasses and the ginger, I think if you did cinnamon, that would work too. It smells really, really good in my house right now. Now, back when this was written, this was usually eaten cold the day after it was made, but you can reheat it and eat it warm. Today, it's usually eaten warm, and by the 20th century, it was usually eaten warm, but it's really up to you. Here we go.
All right, let's see.
Oh, that's really, really good. Oh, that is really, really good. Really not attractive. Really, really tasty though.
Yeah. I'm hungry.
The molasses is the dominant flavor, but it's not bitter at all, because sometimes molasses is bitter.
So that's the thing with molasses. You got to be careful it's not too bitter, right? That's why I think some versus our sugar usage today, the sort of more molasses-heavy cooking of the past might be a bit off-putting. But if done right, I think, yeah, a pudding like this could be pretty palatable to the modern diet. Though, if he was eating the version from, like, the 1650s, it might be a little bland.
The bitterness is completely gone. You just have the sweetness, so it's almost like caramelly. That's really, really good. Okay, so here's what we need to do. This should be on many, many Thanksgiving tables this year.
Yeah.
But people are not going to want to eat it because it looks like... it doesn't look good.
Yeah.
So somehow you have to make it and dish it up before your guests see it and coat it with the whipped cream. You put the whipped cream on it, it's fine. Put it in a bowl, put it in a little cup.
Just put a layer of whipped cream on top, no one can tell.
Put the whipped cream on it. They're gonna really, really like this. I promise. As long as they don't see it. It's really, really good. That's addictive. Yeah, Indian pudding. You don't see it around very often anymore, and I can see why, like visually, not great. But I think it needs to make a comeback, at least in my household.
It'd be interesting. I don't know, any New Englanders watching? Do you guys ever eat any Indian pudding, or do you see it made up in New England? Because like I said, I don't think I've ever seen Indian pudding anywhere, to be honest with you, at least not out in person. But now I'd be curious to know if anyone has encountered it out in the wild somewhere.
Well, I'm going to be putting this on my Thanksgiving dinner table. Honestly, I doubted when I first saw it that a quote that I had found about how delicious this dish is would really hold up. But I gotta say, I agree with the 1811 newsboy's address to his patrons that says Indian pudding, which by odds exceeds the ambrosia of the gods.
Wow.
So yeah, make your Indian pudding, check out the pins in the link in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Alrighty, there we go. So our first Tasting History reaction on the channel. I enjoyed this one. You know, it was definitely interesting to learn about Indian pudding, something which I'd heard of, but which I really knew nothing about. So this was definitely an educational one for me. I found it quite entertaining. Yeah, maybe Indian pudding needs to make a comeback, though I don't know how. I mean, maybe a rebranding could be done in the current year. But yeah, I mean, maybe I'll make it for myself at some point. Definitely, I'd be interested. I mean, maybe it didn't look the most appetizing, but all those ingredients put together, you're like, that's probably going to taste pretty good. So I was surprised that it did. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you'd like to see more tasting history reactions, then hey, leave a like, leave a comment, all that good stuff. And if you'd like to see some more exclusive content from me, you can check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I hope you're all having a fantastic day today. I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.